Hi, this is Raphael Mudge. Welcome to Tradecraft, a course on red team operations. Tradecraft is a skill acquired through experience in a trade, often used to discuss skill in espionage. In this course, we'll go through the skills and background necessary to execute a targeted attack as an external actor with Cobalt Strike. This course is broken up into 9 lectures. In lectures 1 and 2, we'll cover the basics of using the Metasploit framework and using Cobalt Strike and how they work together. In lectures 3 and 4, we'll talk about how to get a foothold into a modern organization. We'll craft an attack package, and we'll use different delivery mechanisms to get it to our target. In lectures 5 through 7, we'll talk about what to do once you get in. We'll talk about low and slow asynchronous post-exploitation with Cobalt Strike's beacon. We'll talk about interactive post-exploitation with the Metasploit framework's Meterpreter. And we'll talk about abusing trust relationships and Active Directory in Part 7, Lateral Movement. In lectures 8 and 9, we'll go into advanced topics. In lecture 8, we'll talk about the different types of defenses you might encounter that might prevent you from getting a foothold and how to go around those defenses or avoid triggering them in the first place. In lecture 9, we'll talk about how to coordinate multiple attack servers in your engagement through Cobalt Strike and do so in a team environment. That is the Tradecraft course in a nutshell. With that, let's go ahead and get started with Lecture 1. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into Lecture 1 of Tradecraft, Introduction. In this lecture, I'll introduce the Metasploit framework, I'll introduce Armitage, and I'll introduce Cobalt Strike. I will also try to give you an idea of how Armitage and Cobalt Strike are different tools. We'll then go into how the Metasploit framework is organized. I'll take you through the Metasploit framework modules and how they work together. I will then give you an orientation of the Cobalt Strike user interface. The goal of this lecture is not to teach you how to use Metasploit, but rather to get you and I speaking the same vocabulary. So let's talk about Metasploit. The Metasploit framework is a collection of offensive capabilities that work really well together. The Metasploit framework is open source under the BSD license, and it's backed by a well-respected vendor in the information security industry, Rapid7. Rapid7 acquired the Metasploit framework project from its founder, H.D. Moore, in 2009. Today, the Metasploit framework is under active development by both full-time employees at Rapid7 and members of the Metasploit framework community. Members of the community are quite active, submitting modules that provide new exploits and new post-exploitation capability, while the full-time employees at Rapid7 clean these modules up, provide feedback, guidance, and, of course, write their own modules too. If you'd like to learn more about the Metasploit framework and what Rapid7 is doing with it, I encourage you to go to www.metasploit.com. Me? I'm not a Metasploit developer. I'm the developer of Armitage. Armitage is an open source front end for the Metasploit framework that was originally built for cyber defense exercises. The thing that really allowed Armitage to take off is its ability to allow Red Team to collaborate. Meaning, if you break into a system, you and I can control that compromised system at the same time. Armitage has a big emphasis on post-exploitation, mostly because when I'm participating in an exercise, I like having tools that allow me to mess with the blue team and have some fun at their expense. Armitage was released in December 2010, and in its first year, it had a lot of updates, over 30 of them. Since then, Armitage has become a lot more mature, and now it averages about 5 or 6 updates a year. You can learn more about Armitage at www.fastandeasyhacking.com. Cobalt Strike is a different animal from Armitage. When I was developing Armitage, I was working for a defense contractor providing red team services to a Department of Defense customer. My job was threat emulation. And when I was doing this work, I noticed that the tools available to me were good for what they did, but that there were a lot of gaps. And I decided to start filling in those gaps for people who have to do red team assessments. And those gaps, those tools that fill in those gaps, that's Cobalt Strike. What does Cobalt Strike do? It gives you the tools to get a foothold through social engineering. It gives you the ability to stay on a host with low and slow command and control. It gives you the ability to escape tough egress restrictions by communicating over DNS. It also gives you the ability to leverage the identity of a compromised user and log into any website that they've logged into through its browser pivoting capability. Cobalt Strike can also control multiple servers from one client, allowing you to orchestrate an attack with multiple points of presence on the internet. And because it's a tool and I sell it, Cobalt Strike generates reports. Now let's go into how the Metasploit framework is organized. Each Metasploit capability is a module. The modules are organized into a tree, and the root nodes of the tree are auxiliary, exploit, payload, and post. Modules are referenced by path. So when I talk about SSH_login, I'm really referring to the module that lives in auxiliary, scanner, SSH_login. Here's kind of an orientation of each of those module trees. Auxiliary modules are organized by what the module does and the service it affects. For example, auxiliary scanner, those are modules to scan a service. Auxiliary scanner SSH, those are modules to scan the SSH service. Some auxiliary trees are not broken up by service. Some are just broken up by broad functionality. For example, auxiliary server. Those are modules to stand up a server to either collect credentials or, in the case of browser autopwn, fingerprint the client and launch an exploit against them. Exploit modules are organized by operating system and the service they affect. For example, exploit Windows SMB. Those are exploits for the SMB service on Windows. Exploit Windows browser. Those are exploits for browsers that run on Windows. Operating system doesn't have to be just Windows though. It can be multi, which means an exploit that works against multiple operating systems. So exploit multi-browser, those are browser exploits that work across platforms. And you'll see a healthy number of Java exploits there. Post modules are organized by operating system and then functionality. So post Windows gather are post modules to gather information from a compromised Windows system. Payloads are organized by operating system, payload name, and communication channel. So payload Windows Meterpreter Reverse TCP is a Windows payload called Meterpreter that communicates back to you, the attacker, by trying to establish a TCP connection. Now let's talk about how those modules work together. Auxiliary modules are the miscellaneous toolkit of the Metasploit framework. If a module is not an exploit, if it's not a post module, if it's not a payload, it is by default an auxiliary module. For the sake of this slide, I just want to focus on a few of them. Some auxiliary modules can fingerprint a service, auxiliary scanner modules, for example. When a module fingerprints a service, it will update the database with information about that service. This database is shared by Cobalt Strike and the Metasploit framework. Auxiliary modules can also log into a service and verify whether or not credentials work. When an auxiliary module successfully logs into a service, it will update the Metasploit framework database with those working credentials. Now, here's how the other modules work together. Exploit modules have one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to get code execution. Once an exploit module gets code execution, it hands off execution to a payload. Payloads have two parts: the part that executes on the compromised system, and a payload handler, which acts as a server to control the payload running within the Metasploit framework. When a payload running on a compromised system is connected to its handler running in the Metasploit framework, you have a session. A session is active control over a compromised host. Post modules are pre-scripted post-exploitation actions that interact with a session. Now let's go a little bit deeper into this. Some auxiliary modules will establish a session. If I use SSH_login to log into a host, I will get a shell session. Why is SSH_login an auxiliary module but not an exploit? The reason SSH_login is an auxiliary module is because it does not take a payload. Exploits always take a payload. If an attack does not take a payload, then it's an auxiliary module. Let's say I have a privilege escalation exploit, one that interacts with a session and it takes a payload. Is it a post module or is it an exploit? The answer is it's an exploit. Exploit windows local are local exploits. Local exploits take a payload and they interact with a session. Now that we've got an idea of how the Metasploit framework is organized, let's take a look at the Metasploit framework in action. Here we are in Kali Linux. To start the Metasploit framework console, I'm going to type MSF console and press enter. Once the Metasploit framework console is started, we will be able to use it to configure and launch modules. To tell the Metasploit framework to use a module, type use and the full path to the module, in this case auxiliary scanner SSH_login. Now, to configure a module for your situation, you need to set options. To do this, type show options to see which options exist and use set option name to set the option value. In this case, we're going to set our host to a target we want to SSH into. We're going to set username and password. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Let's set our host to 192.168.95194. Let's set username to msfadmin, which is a username I happen to know. And let's set password to msfadmin. When we're ready to run the module, I'm going to type exploit-j, which means run the exploit or run the module in the background as a job. This will allow us to do other things while the module runs. Now that the module is complete, let's go through how to read the output of a module. If you see a message that starts with a blue star, that means the message is informational. We can see the console started a brute force and it tried to log in with the user msfadmin and a password of blank. Why did it try a blank password? Well, if we scroll up and look at our options, we can see that blank passwords was left set to true, which means regardless of however else we configured the module, this module will also try a blank password for each user. If you see a red dash prefix message, that's an error. We can see that this error is telling us that the username msfadmin with the password blank failed. If you see a green cross prefix message, that means success or something good. In this case, we can see the Metasploit framework is telling us that the user msfadmin, password msfadmin worked. We can also see above it that Command Shell Session 1 has opened up. Cool. To see which sessions we have, type Sessions. To interact with a session, type Sessions, -I for interact, and the session ID, in this case, Session 1. I am now in the context of the shell session. Any commands I type will get executed through that shell. Now to go back to the Metasploit framework, type Control-Z to put the session in the background and press Y for yes. We are now back in the Metasploit framework console. Don't type exit, that will kill your session, and yes, I have done that before. So that's a quick introduction to the Metasploit framework console. Now let's talk about the Cobalt Strike interface. Here's a screenshot of Cobalt Strike. The Cobalt Strike interface is broken up into three parts. The module browser allows you to browse for and search for Metasploit framework modules. The targets area shows the hosts in your database. The tabs area. Each action you take in Cobalt Strike will open up a new tab with all the commands issued on your behalf and their output. Every shell, every console, every screenshot, every browser will show up as a different tab. Now let's talk about how to read the Cobalt Strike targets view. Each host will have its own icon. The icon will look like a computer monitor with an operating system logo inside of it. If the icon is red with lightning bolts, that means the system is compromised. There is a session associated with that host. Below each icon is the IP address of the host. Below each IP address, you may see information about the session and a label if you or someone on your team assigned a label to the host. If you see green lines emanating from a compromised host, they represent a pivot, meaning that compromised host has been turned into a hot point to attack other hosts. If you see a bright green line, that represents a pivot that is in use, meaning a session on a compromised host is dependent on another session for you to reach it. Cobalt Strike has icons for many different operating systems and their variants. You can see that there are 4 icons for Windows and its different eras. There's icons for different flavors of Unix, devices, and even mobile devices. Now, let's take a quick look at Cobalt Strike. I'm going to change directory to the Cobalt Strike folder and type /Cobalt Strike to start it. I'm the developer of Cobalt Strike, and even I have to use a trial. Press OK and press Connect. You don't need to change anything here. Cobalt Strike will ask you if you want to start the Metasploit framework for you. The answer is yes. Cobalt Strike will now try to start the Metasploit framework in the background. Until the Metasploit framework is ready to accept a connection, you will see a connection refused message over and over again. This is completely normal while the Metasploit framework starts up. Here we are in Cobalt Strike. You'll notice we have our targets area, our module browser, and an open tab. The open tab is a Metasploit framework console. When you use Cobalt Strike, you do not lose any of the power of the Metasploit framework console. You can do everything through it. As we did earlier, we can type use, auxiliary, scanner, SSH, SSH_login, and show options to configure and run a module. You can do this through the console in Cobalt Strike, no problem. You can also search for SSH login through Cobalt Strike and double-click it. Here we have the Cobalt Strike module launcher dialog. This table has all the same information available to us through show options. To edit an option, double-click it and type in a value. In this case, I'll put in a host, 192.168.95.194. I will also double-click username, make it MSFadmin, and double-click password and make it MSFadmin. To launch the module, press Launch. Cobalt Strike will open a new tab, issue commands on our behalf, and we will see the output of that command. Here you can see we have the same output as we had with our MSF console demo a moment ago. We also have a red host with lightning bolts in our targets area to indicate a compromised system with a session associated with it. Now, how do we interact with it? We can type sessions, and we can do sessions-I if we like, or press Control-I for interact. Cobalt Strike will open up a dialog with all the different sessions available to you. You can highlight one, press select, and now we have a tab where we may interact with that shell session. What's nice with Cobalt Strike is I can flip back and forth between my console tabs and my session tabs without a problem. You don't need to background things and go back and forth. I can also right-click on the host, and there will be a menu for any sessions associated with that host, and I can go to that session menu and press Interact and get a tab as well. So that's a little bit on how to use a console through Cobalt Strike, how to search for a module, and how to launch it, and how to interact with a session. To reset the module browser back to normal, just clear the module browser search box. As you use Cobalt Strike, you will find that the graph view makes a great demo. But as soon as you start dealing with more than a handful of hosts, you will find it cumbersome. I highly recommend that you use the Cobalt Strike table view when you're dealing with more than a few hosts. To change to the table view, go to Cobalt Strike, Set Target View, Table View. The table view shows the same information. You can see the operating system icons. You can see if a host is compromised. You will see any host labels, any session information, and you can see if a pivot is present as well. In this lecture, I introduced the Metasploit framework, I introduced Armitage, and I introduced Cobalt Strike and what's different. We also talked about how the Metasploit framework is organized into modules and talked about how those modules interact with each other. I also gave you an orientation of the Cobalt Strike user interface. This concludes Lecture 1 of Tradecraft.